I thought it was the end. Then I opened my eyes and saw the alien woman in tears. The last thing Crew Chief Davin Rourke remembered clearly was the sound the hull made when Corridor 7 failed. It wasn't a bang. It wasn't dramatic the way catastrophes in training simulations always were. It was a sound more like a held breath finally released, a long tearing exhalation of metal under impossible strain, and then a wall of pressure that picked him off his feet and drove him sideways into a support column hard enough to strip the lights from his vision and the air from his lungs at the same instant. After that, nothing. Before that, the Sundra Asterisk, a Goliath-class mid-range freight and survey carrier, had been doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing, sitting in a lazy survey orbit around HD 38801, a yellow dwarf in the outer Kalthari reach that the Hegemony Cartography Division had designated as a possible candidate for a second-wave colonization assessment. Routine work. The kind of post that experienced crew chiefs like Davin either accepted because they needed a quiet cycle after something loud, or refused because the pay didn't justify 6 months of interstellar boredom. Davin had accepted it because he needed quiet. He'd had 2 years of loud. The Asundra carried a crew of 7 humans from various hegemony contract roles, and 4 Ithari, the slender bipedal race with the pale violet-gray skin and the wide luminous eyes who made up a substantial portion of the hegemony's civilian survey workforce. The Ithari had been mapping stars since before humans had invented the wheel. They were precise, calm under pressure, and famously difficult to read. Their faces carried fewer of the blunt emotional signals humans used to navigate each other, and what expressions they did produce required a human to spend some time around them before anything landed with meaning. Davin had spent 5 months and 11 days around them, enough time to learn a few things. He knew, for instance, that when Chief Navigator Cyril touched the thin crest of silver-white hair at her temple with 2 fingertips, she was working through a calculation that troubled her. He knew that when survey specialist Vethais went very still in a room, he was listening to something no one else had noticed yet. He knew that when Medic Eris, whose actual name was a Ithori tonal construct that translated imperfectly to Eris, and whom the crew had called that from week 2 without any complaint from her. When Eris stood with her hands folded at the small of her back and her wide pale silver eyes aimed at something in the middle distance, she was not daydreaming. She was deciding something. He knew these things the way a careful man learns anything, by paying attention over time. Not because the Ithari were exotic curiosities, because they were his crew. That was the kind of crew Chief Davin was. He'd come to the Asterisk Asundra from a military contracting post he'd held for 22 months, doing crew logistics for a hegemony rapid response unit that operated in the Kalthari buffer zone, the region of disputed space between the inner hegemony systems and the Goliath frontier, where 3 or 4 different factions with 3 or 4 different claims to 3 or 4 different asteroid-rich moons kept everyone in a permanent state of low-boil conflict that occasionally flared into something louder. It had not been pleasant work. It had been necessary, and he was good at it. And after 22 months of it, he'd walked into the contracting office at Paulith Hub and asked, quietly, for something that wouldn't involve him knowing in advance which supply routes needed armed escort. The survey posting had seemed perfect. Stars that didn't care about borders, instruments instead of weapons assessments, a crew small enough that he could actually know all of them. He had not counted on it becoming something he'd be reluctant to leave. The first month had been adjustment, the standard friction of any new crew, amplified by the species divide, by the different communication registers, and the different assumptions about what "ready to begin" meant. The Ithori tended to need to understand the complete context of a task before they'd commit to starting it, which read as hesitation to humans accustomed to diving in, and which Davin had spent 3 weeks negotiating between Vethais and Greaves before they'd found a rhythm. The second month had been smoother. By the third month, the 11 of them had stopped being 11 individuals in a hall and had become something more specific. Eris had been the last to become legible to him, which he suspected was intentional on her part. Ithori medics operated under a principle that he'd read about in the briefing materials, but hadn't understood until he saw it in practice. Vethali Merideth asterisk, which translated approximately as the physician remains outside the system she serves. The idea was that a medic's effectiveness depended on a certain remove, that she needed to see the crew clearly and couldn't do that if she was too far inside the social fabric. So Eris was professional in a way that was distinct from the professionalness of someone who was simply reserved. She was professionally outside. She participated, she was present at meals and briefings, and the small social events the crew generated organically over long months, but she participated at a slight remove, the way a conductor stands at the edge of the orchestra. He'd respected it. He'd also slowly, with the patience that was one of the few things he'd kept intact from years of difficult work, learned to see around it, not through it, which would have felt like a violation of something deliberate, around it. The parts of Eris that were visible in the margins of her professional positioning, in the precise way she moved through a room, in the particular direction her attention went when she thought no one was tracking it. He'd been tracking it. In month 3, he'd noticed that she went to the observation window in the aft survey bay at approximately 2200 ship time, when the bay was empty, and stood there for 10 or 15 minutes looking out at whatever stars they were currently passing. He'd walked in on this once, entirely by accident. He was doing a nightly walkthrough and hadn't known her schedule, and she'd been standing with her arms loosely at her sides and her hair unbraided, the way it would be now in the medical bay emergency lighting, looking at a star field the way people looked at things they loved when they thought they were alone with it. She'd turned when she heard him, and her hair was braided again before he'd processed what he was looking at, not because she'd moved faster than he could see, but because she had the kind of composure that could rearrange itself between one breath and the next. "Crew chief," she'd said, not startled, simply acknowledging. "Medic," he'd said. He gestured at the observation window. "Good one tonight." She'd glanced back at it. "The Vithrani drift," she'd said. "We'll be past it in 9 hours. It's rare to have this angle at this distance. I prefer to," she'd paused, as if deciding how much of the sentence was hers to give. "Observe it properly." "Yeah," he'd said. "Me too." And he'd come to stand beside her and looked at the drift, a slow-turning nebula remnant that looked, from their current distance and angle, like a spread hand of luminescent color against the dark. And they'd stood there for 12 minutes in a silence that had surprised him with how easy it was, before he'd finished the walkthrough and wished her good night and left. He'd started doing the aft walkthrough at 2200 after that. She'd never acknowledged it directly. She'd also never stopped being there. That was month 3. Month 4 had added the occasional direct conversation about stellar cartography, about the differences between Ithori and human approaches to documentation, about the specific calibration problem with the Sundra *S secondary scanner, array that Eris had identified in her medical records cross-referencing exercise. She read everything. He'd learned this about her early, and that had turned out to be a genuine calibration issue that saved them 3 weeks of skewed data. By month 5, they were talking after the observation window stood in quiet, sometimes for an hour, in the unhurried way of two people who had found the particular ease of someone who didn't need to perform or manage the impression they were making. He was not confused about what that was after month 5. He was simply patient. There were protocols. There was her professional positioning. There was the question of what the right shape of this was in a context he'd never navigated before, not because he was intimidated by difference, but because he respected it enough to want to get it right. He'd been working himself up to a careful, deliberate approach when the star decided to eject. The Asundra shouldn't have been anywhere near a stellar event. HD 38801 was flagged in the Hegemony Survey database as stable, a star in the quiet middle of its lifespan, 4 billion years from anything interesting. The instruments confirmed it, the approach scans confirmed it, and the Ithori navigators who had been mapping this sector for 30 years confirmed it. What no instrument had caught, what the combined observational apparatus of the Hegemony Cartography Division had not detected, because no one had been looking for it, because there was no reason to look, was the hairline magnetic filament threading through HD 38801's outer convective zone. The result of a slow internal anomaly that had been building for 180,000 years, and had chosen the specific 3-hour window of the Asundra S closest survey past to complete its long geological patience and release. The star didn't explode. It wasn't that dramatic either. What it did was eject. Davin was in the forward observation corridor reviewing the day's scan data when the ship's alert system tripped into yellow. Not the aggressive red of an immediate combat or collision threat, but yellow, the color of something is developing that you should be watching . He'd been in enough situations to recognize the particular quality of yellow that preceded red. The brief suspended moment when the data was assembled and the assessment was running, and the ship's systems were calculating whether this was a drill or a decision point. It was not a drill. Navigator Cyril's voice came through the corridor speakers with the Ithori quality of being completely calm while delivering information of the worst kind. Crew chief to the bridge. Stellar anomaly in progress. Advising immediate departure from current survey position. He was moving before she finished the sentence. On the bridge, the forward displays showed what the Asundra S sensors were reading in the filtered spectrum. HD 38801, which had been a perfectly ordinary yellow dwarf for 4 billion years and approximately 140 hours of their survey time, was doing something its entire classification profile said it should not be doing. The chromosphere was brightening. A coronal mass of extraordinary scale was forming along the star's equatorial band, with the accelerating urgency of a geological process that had just crossed its threshold. Drive response, he asked, not to anyone specific, to whoever had the answer. Insufficient at current range. That was Greaves at the propulsion console, and his voice had the flat quality of someone reporting a number they wished were different. We can push to full output. We're not going to outrun the ejector radius in the time we have. Portside shields are our best option. Angle the hull. Do it, Davin said. Cyril optimal facing. Calculated. She was already doing it. The ship turned with the smooth efficiency of Ithori navigation work. The Asundra was not a fast vessel, but she was responsive, and Cyril extracted every unit of response the frame would give. Behind them and closing, the star completed what it had been slowly working toward for 180,000 years. The eruption was not visible to the naked eye in the way popular imagination conceived of stellar events. It came first as a needle of electromagnetic pressure on the instruments, then as a rising tide of sensor noise that crossed the threshold into physical force, and then as the roar of charged matter against the port hull shields that was so much larger than the test cases in training that the comparison became meaningless. The shields held mostly. Corridor 7 did not. He came back to consciousness in pieces. Sound first, a low, steady tone that meant emergency power. The hiss of a recycled air system working too hard. Somewhere farther away, a rhythmic dripping that meant breech seal foam had activated and was doing its job. Then sensation, the floor against his back, which meant he was lying down. Something soft and dense pressed along his right side, a thermal blanket, he realized, which meant someone had found him after the event and covered him. His head ached with a depth that said the column impact had been substantial. His right shoulder was a landscape of pain that shifted when he breathed, suggesting at least one cracked rib. He had been in worse shape. He had been in much worse. He opened his eyes. The emergency lighting in the medical bay, because that's where he was, the cot and the overhead panel placement made it clear, was the low amber of reduced power running, casting everything in the color of old firelight. The bay smelled of antiseptic, and the faintly sharp metallic sent the Ethori medipacks left behind when they were opened. And Eris was sitting beside him. He'd expected the ship's doctor, an older human named Cavil who communicated primarily through grunts and the occasional disapproving glance. But Cavil wasn't there. Eris was, sitting on the low stool that usually held charts and instrument trays, with her knees drawn slightly up and her long-fingered pale violet hands resting open on her thighs, and her silver-white hair loose from its work braid in a way he had never once seen in 5 months aboard the Asundra, because Eris never let her hair loose on shift. He knew she was off shift in this moment, not because of the hair alone, but because of what was on her face. She was crying. The Ethori didn't cry the way humans did, not tears exactly, not the same mechanism. What they produced under extreme emotional pressure was a faint luminescent seeping at the outer corners of their wide eyes, a pale bioluminescence that their biology had evolved across millennia for purposes that Ethori scholars still debated, that human xenobiologists called stress luminescence in their papers, and that the crew of the Asundra had simply, privately, in the language of people who spend long months in close quarters, called going silver. Eris was going silver. The faint glow at the corners of her pale silver eyes was soft and steady, like something lit from very far inside, and her expression, which he had learned to read, in 5 months of paying attention, was not a medical expression. It was not the careful neutral she wore when she was assessing a situation. It was not the precise focus of someone deciding something. Her face in the amber emergency light was the face of someone who had been afraid, and was still afraid, and was trying, with the particular discipline of someone accustomed to keeping things internal, not to let it be seen. She hadn't noticed he was awake. He lay still for a moment, watching her. The ache in his head made it easier not to move. But he kept watching, because this was Eris, who was precise and composed, and who had explained to him in week 6, in response to a blunt question he'd asked, because he wanted the crew to understand each other, that Ethori stress luminescence was involuntary, and that in Ethori culture it was considered an intensely private expression, visible only to those with whom one had chosen to share it. "We do not," she had said, in the careful English she used with most of the human crew, "go silver in public." He had nodded and said he understood and had never mentioned it again. He hadn't forgotten it either. She became aware of him. He saw it the instant she did, the slight adjustment of her posture, the way those wide eyes dropped to his face. For a half-second she did nothing. Then, very deliberately, she lifted her right hand to the corner of her left eye and pressed her 2 middle fingers there, and when she lowered her hand the silver was gone, tucked back inside her composure where her discipline kept it. "You're awake," she said. Her voice was even. Seems like. His own voice was rougher than he'd expected, the kind of rough that came from time spent unconscious. How long? 11 hours. She reached for the medic's tablet on the tray beside her. You sustained a significant impact to the right cranial region and a compression fracture of the 7th and 8th ribs on the right side. Nothing that warrants more intervention than what has already been done. You should heal without complication. 11 hours, he said again. Approximately. The ship. She paused just a fraction, just enough for him to notice. Structurally intact. Emergency power is maintaining life support in 8 of the 11 habitable sections. Corridor 7 is sealed. The portside communications array is damaged. Long-range signals are compromised. How compromised? We have sent a distress beacon on the standard hegemony frequency. Receipt is not confirmed. He processed this. Casualties. The pause this time was longer. Engineer Pell has a broken collarbone and 2 cracked teeth. Survey specialist Vethis has burns on his left forearm from a conduit breach. They are healing. Dr. Cavell has a concussion and has been confined to his quarters. 3 of the remaining crew have minor lacerations. She set the tablet back down. No fatalities. No fatalities, he said. He let that settle. Heiress. She met his eyes. No fatalities, he said again differently. Her composure held, but something moved behind those wide silver eyes, something he didn't have a name for yet, in the vocabulary he'd built for her over 5 months. Something that she didn't tuck back in the way she'd tucked back the silver. No, she agreed quietly, no fatalities. He watched her for another moment and then said, "You were doing that for a while, weren't you, sitting there?" Her eyes dropped to her hands. He had not seen her do that before, the downward look, the avoidance, the thing humans did when they were caught at something private. "You required monitoring," she said. "Right. Cranial impact requires observation for delayed presentation of." "Heiress." She stopped. He said carefully, because he was a man who paid attention and he understood now what he was handling. "I'm not going to make it into something it isn't. I'm just going to say, I saw, and thank you." The silver came back, very briefly, at the outer corner of her left eye. She didn't press her fingers to it this time. She let it be there for one moment and then it was gone. "You should rest," she said. "Yeah," he agreed. "I'm going to, but heiress," he waited until she looked at him again. "Is there anyone you need me to be aware of before I sleep? Anyone else who's—" "I told you, no fatalities." "I know. I'm asking about you." The look she gave him then was one he didn't have filed anywhere in 5 months of learning to read her. He'd seen her precise, efficient, composed, privately amused, privately troubled. He hadn't seen this. "Rest," she said. And this time her voice had something in it, something beneath the even professional surface, that he thought, if he was reading it correctly, which he might not be, sounded like someone trying very hard not to show that they were relieved. He closed his eyes. The Asundra drifted for 4 days before the distress beacon was answered. In those 4 days, a great deal happened that was practical and necessary and demanding. Davin got himself upright 22 hours after he woke, over Eris's stated objection and Cavell's grunted endorsement. The doctor, with a concussion, was not his own best argument, and walked the 8 intact corridors taking stock. The ship was livable, which was better than it could have been. Corridor 7 was sealed with breach foam and would stay that way until professional repair crews got to her. 2 of the 3 equipment lockers in that section were on the 7 side of the seal, which made certain workarounds necessary, but Pell with 1 arm was more inventive about workarounds than most engineers with 2. The emergency power reserves, topped off 2 weeks prior in routine procedure that Davin was now privately grateful for, gave them approximately 12 days of safe operation at reduced consumption. The beacon had been transmitting since hour 2. The crew came together in the way crews either do or don't in a crisis, and his crew did, because he had spent 5 months making sure they were a crew, and not 11 individuals sharing a hull. The Ithari members held no corners. What they had, they shared with no ceremony, in the practical way of people who understood that species lines stopped meaning anything when the hull needed sealing. Vethis, who had never in 5 months asked Greaves for anything, quietly showed him a recalibration of the passive beacon relay that doubled its effective transmission radius. Greaves, who had been skeptical of the Ithari survey approach for most of the first 2 months, implemented it without comment. Cyril ran navigation and power optimization from a cold console, having rerouted her working terminal through a junction that the blast hadn't reached, and she worked 16-hour shifts as if this were simply what the situation called for, which it was, and as if she intended to see the ship through it, which she did. She was the most efficient person Davin had ever worked with, including people who'd operated in actual combat conditions. Eris ran the medical bay alone for 4 days. Cavel's concussion was genuine and substantial. The doctor was able to sit up by day 2 and provide verbal guidance by day 3, which helped, but the physical work and the decisions and the paperwork were hers. She handled Pell's collarbone, Vethise's burns, the 3 crew members with lacerations, and Davin's ribs, and she tracked every patient's status on a hand-updated chart when the bay's automated system dropped to minimal function. And she did all of this with the same precise competence she applied to everything, and with no visible indication of how many hours she was putting in. He saw her at meals twice. Both times she ate quickly and went back. He didn't say anything about the amber light and the silver at the corners of her eyes. He didn't mention it to anyone, didn't allow any change in how he addressed her professionally, didn't give any signal in the shared spaces of the ship that something had shifted. She had shown him something private, and he was not going to make it into currency. He kept it where she'd trusted him to keep it, in the place where things that mattered lived, undisturbed. On the evening of the second day, he was in the aft survey bay, the only common space that still had full interior lighting, which made it the default gathering point for off-shift crew. When Ando, the youngest member of the survey team, sat down across from him with the look of someone deciding whether to say something. Davin waited. "The medic doesn't sleep," Ando said finally. "She sleeps," Davin said. "I don't think she does. Not much." He looked down at the standard issue emergency ration he was eating without enthusiasm. "She was in the medical bay when I went past at 300. She was sitting at her workstation writing charts. She didn't look like she'd slept." "She's a professional," Davin said. "She knows her limits." "Right," said Ando, with the tone of someone who wasn't sure that answered his question. "She'll tell me if she needs something," Davin said. "And if she doesn't, I'll notice anyway." Ando nodded slowly. He seemed to find this reassuring, which told Davin something about what the crew needed right now, not necessarily a solution to every problem, but the confidence that the problems were being tracked. On the third day, he did something he didn't announce. He stopped by the medical supply alcove. Eris was in the forward section conducting a check on Pell's collarbone, and looked at the medical log. Patient observation logs were not private records on a working ship. They were part of the official documentation, accessible to the crew chief in the event of a critical incident review. He had a documented reason to look, and he also had another reason, the one he was actually acting on. He wanted to understand what 11 hours of sitting beside an unconscious crew member, in a dark ship running on emergency power, meant in the life of someone who didn't go silver in public. Her log entries were terse, as he'd expected: timestamps, vitals, intervention notes, the minimal shorthand of a medic who had been trained to record facts rather than narrate them. The interventions were documented cleanly. The Medipack application, the analgesic protocol, the positioning notes, the rib assessment, the cranial pressure monitoring. Everything she'd done was there and accounted for and correct. But the timestamps were unambiguous. She had sat with him for the full 11 hours. Checks conducted at 20-minute intervals throughout. No documented rest period. No transfer of observation to another crew member for any portion of the 11 hours. He stood in the alcove for a moment with the log in his hand. Then he set it back in its place and closed the alcove and stood in the corridor for another moment, thinking about the aft observation window at 2200, and the 12 minutes of comfortable silence, and the particular quality of someone who unbraids their hair when they think they're alone with something they love. He went back to his post. He thought about it for a long time. On the evening of the third day, he brought 2 ration packs to the medical bay. It was a small act, nearly unremarkable. Crew chiefs brought things to crew members all the time. It was one of the practical expressions of the job, the recognition that people working in isolated posts on emergency power didn't always remember to stop. But he knew it wasn't unremarkable, and she would know it too. It was a line he was drawing deliberately, a step from the professional margin into something else, and he wanted to take it with his eyes open. She was at her workstation when he came in. The medical bay at this hour had the particular quietness of a space where someone had been working alone for a long time, the specific ambient silence of concentrated effort and the absence of casual noise. The amber emergency light gave everything that deep warmth again, closer to firelight than day, and she was writing in the incident log, and she didn't look up immediately when he came through the door. He set 1 ration pack on the corner of her workstation. She looked at it, then she looked at him. "You haven't eaten since 1100, he said. It was 2150. "I was going to," she stopped. A brief pause. "Thank you." He took the other stool, the one not beside her, the one at the supply console across the small room, leaving the space between them, and opened his own pack. She opened hers. They ate in silence for a while. It was a different silence than the aft observation window silences. Those had been spacious, optional, the silence of 2 people who had found a mutual ease. This one was narrower and carried more weight, the silence of people who had been through something and were sitting on either side of it. "Ando thinks you don't sleep," he said. Ando is 23 and has not yet learned the difference between she doesn't sleep and she sleeps at hours I'm not tracking. She ate a precise forkful. "I sleep in intervals." "It's adequate for the situation." "Is it?" "It is sufficient," she said, with the slight shift in phrasing that he'd learned meant she was being precise rather than reassuring. He considered this. "I'm going to ask you something directly, and I want a direct answer." She set her fork down and looked at him. "How are you?" A pause. It was not the pause of someone formulating an answer. It was the pause of someone deciding how much of the answer to give. "I am," she stopped, started again. "I have been a working medic for 18 years. I am accustomed to crisis response. I am accustomed to providing care in inadequate conditions with incomplete resources. I know my own capacity." She looked at the wall, at the instrument panel, at the thing in the middle distance that Ithori looked at when they were deciding something. "I am not accustomed to managing a situation in which one of my patients was someone She stopped. He waited. "I found the 11 hours difficult," she said finally, in the precise measured voice of someone delivering information as accurately as they can. "More than most critical patient watches I have maintained, for reasons that were not clinical." "Right," he said quietly. She picked up her fork again. They ate in silence for another few minutes, and this silence was different again, closer to the observation window silences, but not quite, because those had been before and this was after, and after is always a different country. "The Vithrani Drift," he said. She looked up. "I think about those nights sometimes," he said. "The observation window, I know it wasn't, I know we weren't, but I think about them." "Yes," she said simply. He met her eyes across the small medical bay, in the amber light that had been their only light for 3 days, with the ship drifting through dark space that didn't care about either of them. "I'm glad the beacon's out," he said. "I'm glad someone's coming. But I want you to know, for whatever it's worth, that these 4 days have been," he searched for the right word and didn't find one in English. "There isn't a word, something with weight." She was looking at him with the expression he didn't have a name for yet, the bedrock one, the one beneath composure. Silver at the very edge of her left eye, just barely. "There is a word in Ithori," she said. "It translates approximately to the quality of what survives a passage." That, he said, yes. She looked at him for another long moment, then down at her ration pack. You should eat, she said. The rib fractures are healing, but you are still technically under observation. I'm being observed, he agreed, and she looked back up at him, and the thing that moved across her precise face at that, the thing that was not quite a smile and was something better, was one he was going to keep in the same place he kept the amber light and the silver at the corners of her eyes. He finished his ration. He collected both empty packs. He said good night from the doorway. Good night, Davin, she said, and she'd used his name again, the second time in 5 months, and this time it was not in a moment of crisis. It was deliberate, chosen, given in the ordinary quiet of a room after a shared meal in a ship held together by breech foam and patience. He went back to his post, and he did not think about the beacon for a long time. The rescue ship was a Hegemony Reach patrol vessel, medium class, and it appeared on the long-range passive sensors before it appeared on comms, which meant they had 4 hours of knowing it was coming before it confirmed their beacon. Those 4 hours had a particular quality aboard the asterisk Asundra. The loosening of a breath no one had admitted they were holding, the gradual return of small human things like humor and appetite, and the impulse to talk about plans that extended beyond the next 12 hours. Davin did what crew chiefs did in those 4 hours. He went around to each section, talked to each person, made sure no one was spinning out alone in a quiet corner. He was good at this. He had always been better at other people's crises than his own. He saved Eris for last, which was deliberate. She was in the medical bay, charting, actual charting, writing up formal incident records for the Hegemony Medical Registry, the bureaucratic work that followed a critical incident and that no one liked and that someone had to do. She had her hair braided back on shift again. She was precise and composed and entirely herself. Rescues confirmed, he said from the doorway. ETA 3 hours 40. I know. She didn't look up from the chart. I've been preparing transfer documentation for the patients who will need continued care. Cable and Pell. And yourself. The Reach patrol vessel will have a full surgical bay. The rib fractures should be assessed under better equipment than we have here. I feel fine. You feel functional, she said. Those are different things, and I think you know that. He leaned against the doorframe. Outside the medical bay, somewhere down the corridor, he could hear Pell and one of the human crew talking about something with increasing animation, which meant they were arguing about something trivial and comfortable, which was its own kind of sign that people were coming back to themselves. Eris, he said, when we transfer to the Reach Patrol, what happens to you? She looked up from the chart then. Her wide silver eyes met his. The same as the rest of the Ithori crew, I expect. Will be documented, assessed, and returned to the nearest Hegemony administrative hub for reassignment. Reassignment. The Asundra will require repairs. It's unlikely we'll return to the same posting. He had known this, in the abstract way you know things you've decided not to think about. Hearing her say it in her even, practical voice made it concrete in a way that was uncomfortable. That's straightforward for you, he asked, moving on. She considered the question with the seriousness she gave every question. Ithori are not, she paused, chose her words. We are not unattached to continuity. We are simply accustomed, perhaps, to understanding that assignments end. She set the chart tablet down on the tray. It is you, I think, who are not asking about reassignment. He looked at her. You're asking about the 4 days, she said. I'm asking about the 11 hours, he said, but the 4 days are part of it. The medical bay was very quiet for a moment. The low ambient hum of life support on emergency power had taken on the character of a companion sound over 4 days. He was going to miss it, he realized, in the specific way you miss the background conditions of an intense experience once it's over. Eris's hands were still on her thighs, open-palmed, in the position he'd first seen them when he woke. She wasn't looking away. "I have served on 7 survey postings since I completed my medical training," she said. "Over 18 years of hegemony contract work. I have had good crews, adequate crews, and one that I would describe as genuinely difficult." A pause. "I have not in that time stayed at a patient's side for 11 hours. He waited. "I stayed," she said carefully, "because I did not want to leave." The words were simple. The weight behind them was not. He took a slow breath, mindful of the ribs. "That's a long way for an Ithori to go, saying that." "Yes," she said, "it is." He pushed off the doorframe and came into the medical bay properly, crossing to the stool beside her workstation. The same stool she'd sat on for 11 hours, and sat down. She turned slightly on her own seat to face him. Their knees were perhaps 18 inches apart. "I paid attention," he said quietly. "To everyone, it's what I do. But somewhere in the last 5 months I started paying different kinds of attention to you. I don't know exactly when it changed. I know that it did." She held his gaze. No silver, not yet. But something in the quality of her stillness had changed, had deepened into the kind of stillness that wasn't composure but was the thing beneath composure, the bedrock thing. "You asked me once," she said, "about the luminescence, what it meant in Ithori terms. I asked, and you explained, and I thanked you and didn't bring it up again." "You didn't." There was something that might have been warmth in her precise voice. That was not the response I expected from a human crew chief asking about alien biology. Most humans ask and then use what they learn as performance. They make a show of their sensitivity. "I'm not interested in performing." "No," she said. "You're not." She was quiet for a moment. "When I was sitting beside you when you weren't waking, I was not simply monitoring your vitals. I was—" She stopped, started again. "I was afraid of what would happen when the ship arrived and there was no longer any practical reason to stay. I was afraid of the conversation I would need to have with myself about what it meant that I did not want to leave. I am accustomed to managing those conversations cleanly, keeping them internal." "But something leaked," he said. A ghost of something moved across her face. Not a smile. The Ithori didn't smile the way humans did. Something quieter than that and more deliberate. "You were not supposed to wake up while I was still." She made a small, precise gesture with one hand. "Going silver," he said gently. She didn't flinch. She held his gaze and said, "Yes." "I'm glad I did," he said. The silver came back to the outer corners of her eyes, not the brief involuntary flash he'd seen in the emergency lighting, but something steadier, something that she wasn't pressing away with 2 fingers this time. She was letting it be visible, in the way she'd told him Ithori only did for those they'd chosen. "The reassignment," he said. "The separate hubs, I don't like those terms." "Neither do I," she said quietly. He leaned forward carefully, mindful of the ribs, and rested his forearms on his knees. Close enough now that he could see the fine detail of her features in the medical bay's better lighting, the pale violet gray of her skin, the exact silver of her eyes, the structure of her face that he'd been learning from a practical distance for months, and was only now allowing himself to simply look at. "What's the hegemony process?" he asked, "for crew members who want to request the same reassignment?" Her eyes held his. "There's a standard petition form. Medical pairs are prioritized if there's a documented working relationship. And if it's not a medical pair, there is still a form," she said. "It requires both parties to submit independently and concurrently." "Does it require a reason?" The faintest luminescent warmth at her eyes. "It requires a stated reason, yes." "I think I can manage a stated reason," he said. She was quiet for a long moment, and he let her have the quiet, because he'd learned over 5 months that she used silence differently than humans did, not as space to fill, but as space to move through, deliberately. "Davin," she said, the first time she had ever used his first name in 5 months that he could recall. He waited. "I should tell you," she said carefully, "that ethori pairings are not casual structures. We are not built for short arrangements." She held his gaze. "If I were to submit a concurrent petition, and if that petition were approved, and if what you're describing were to take the shape I think you mean, it would not, for me, be a convenient arrangement that ends with the next contract." He understood what she was telling him. He sat with it for a moment, the weight of it, the realness of it. "I'm not a man who does convenient arrangements," he said. "I haven't been interested in one in a long time." The silver deepened very slightly at the corners of her eyes. She didn't hide it. "Then I will tell you something else," she said. "When I was sitting beside you in the dark, when the ship was running on reserve power and the beacon was unconfirmed and Cable was concussed and I was the only medical resource on a disabled vessel, I was afraid of many things. Practical things, the status of the hull, the crew, the timeline before rescue." She paused. "But the thing I was most afraid of had no practical resolution. It was simply the prospect of you not waking up." He said nothing. He didn't look away from her. "I do not say that to create obligation," she added, in the precise voice she used when she was being very careful. "I say it because you asked about the 11 hours, and that is the answer." "It's a good answer," he said quietly. "It is an honest one." He reached out slowly, deliberately, with the same careful attention he gave everything, and turned his palm upward on his knee. A question, not a demand. Eris looked at his hand for a moment that stretched into something beyond time. Then she reached out and placed her own hand in his, her long fingers resting against his palm with the particular lightness of someone doing something chosen. They sat like that, in the amber light of a ship coming back to life around them. 3 hours and 40 minutes from rescue, 5 months of careful distance behind them and something else ahead, and neither of them spoke for a while, because neither of them needed to. The Reach patrol vessel was called the *Miventhry*, and it was crewed efficiently and impersonally, the way rescue ships tended to be when their job was logistics and recovery rather than long-term habitation. The transfer took 6 hours. Cable and Pell were assessed and documented. Davin's ribs were imaged, confirmed, and braced in a proper medical support frame that made breathing significantly more comfortable. He filed his petition on the transfer ship's administrative terminal at hour 3, with Eris at the station beside him filing hers independently, as the process required. The duty officer who processed the concurrent petitions gave them one brief look, and then completed the paperwork without comment, which was the particular professionalism of someone who had seen most things and had developed the wisdom to treat them as ordinary. Navigator Cyril, who had somehow always known everything that happened aboard the Asundra before anyone told her, and who expressed this knowledge primarily through the particular angle of her silver-white crest, and a composure so complete it bordered on amusement, said nothing at all when Davin and Eris sat at adjacent seats in the Miventry's common area. She simply touched 2 fingertips to her temple crest, very briefly, which Davin had learned in 5 months meant something like * there it is, then, and which felt, he thought, like a benediction. Vethi's luminescent eye rims brightened perceptibly, which was as close to open enthusiasm as Vethi's ever got about anything, and which Davin suspected translated to something like finally. The human crew members, Pell, Greaves, Survey Tech Ando, were slightly less restrained and slightly louder about it, which was exactly what he'd expected from them, and which made Eris produce the precise, slightly dry expression that was the closest thing she had to a smile, and which he intended to spend a significant amount of time in the future making appear. The Hegemony Administrative Hub at Velthris Station processed their concurrent petition in 14 days, which was faster than average. Velthris was not a beautiful station. It was a functional one, the kind of deep-reach administrative node that existed primarily because the Hegemony needed a place to route its paperwork and its people between postings, and the people who worked there had long since stopped experiencing it as anything other than the transit environment it was. The corridors were clean and uniformly lit, and had the quality of a place that had never tried to be anything more than adequate. The temporary crew quarters were small, identical, and equipped with everything necessary and nothing else. He found it almost restful. After 5 months on the Asundra, after the survey work and the crisis, and the 4 days of amber emergency light, the flat neutral competence of Velthra Station was easy to be inside. He slept properly for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. He filed the incident report, 3 separate versions for 3 separate hegemony divisions, and the petition form, and the insurance documentation that the Asundra *S registry required, and the preliminary crew assessment for the contracting office, and all of it was administrative work that had a definite shape and a definite end, and required nothing of him except patience and accuracy. The others dispersed through the station's temporary housing, according to their needs and their inclinations. Pell and Greaves found each other at something resembling a recreation area on level 9, and spent 3 days arguing about what music counted as appropriate for an off-cycle gathering, which Davin knew because both of them sent him separate accounts of the argument expecting him to arbitrate. He declined, which was also something crew chiefs did. The Ithori crew members occupied the station with their customary efficiency. Vethais submitted his burn treatment documentation within 6 hours of arrival and was cleared for unrestricted activity by day 2, which meant he spent the remaining 12 days in the station's cartography data archive, which was where he wanted to be. Cyril, on the 2nd day, found Davin in the common meal area and sat across from him and said, without preamble, "The petition was submitted this morning." He looked at her. "Which petition?" She gave him the look she reserved for questions she considered already answered. Eris's concurrent petition was submitted at 7:12 this morning. Yours was submitted at 7:19. He hadn't known she knew about it. He probably should have assumed she would. "Cyril," he said. "I'm going to tell you something," she said, in the Ithori conversational register that indicated she was going to tell him something whether or not he wanted to hear it. Eris does not do things impulsively. She considers. She considers at length and she considers carefully, and then she acts on the result of that consideration with complete commitment. She touched 2 fingertips to her temple crest. I have known her for 11 years. I have seen her consider 1 posting transfer request in 11 years. She submitted it before she could change her mind, because she knew that if she thought about it long enough she would find a reason to be more cautious than the situation required. He didn't say anything. She has not, Cyril continued, been in the habit of being incautious. I find this development notable. She stood up, tray in hand, for what it's worth. It's worth something, he said. Thank you. She made the small gesture that meant something like asterisk. This was always going to happen, and took her tray away. The stated reasons on the petitions his, professional continuity and the documented value of an established working relationship, hers, crew stability in high-risk survey environments and the efficiency of documented interspecies professional trust, were technically the practical framing the form required. They were also not entirely untrue. They just weren't the complete truth, and he suspected the processing clerk who handled the paperwork had seen enough of these to know the difference. He thought the duty officer on the Miventhri had understood them perfectly well for what they were. The reassignment came through on a Tuesday. Not that days of the week meant much in the outer reach, but the Asundra had kept Earth standard time and old habits held, and the posting was a hegemony survey pair assignment to the Drelth cluster, an unmapped region in the Midreach that the cartography division had been waiting on stable crew pairs to begin assessing. It was, on paper, identical in structure to the posting they were leaving, a survey carrier, a crew of mixed human and Ithori contract staff, a mandate to map and report and not break anything. He read the posting details at his assigned bunk in the temporary quarters, and then he read them a second time, because the crew manifest included a name in the chief medical officer slot that he recognized. There was a knock at his door which was open. He looked up. Eris stood in the doorframe, her work braid precise, her expression in the particular settled state he'd come to understand as her version of the thing humans called quietly happy, recognizable now, after months of learning the register. "I received the assignment," she said. "I see that." He set the tablet down. "You submitted medical officer as your preferred role." "It is my role," she said. "It is," he agreed, "and I submitted crew chief." She came into the room and stood at the edge of the small desk beside his bunk. This close, he could see the faintest ambient silver at the outer corners of her wide eyes, the steady, chosen kind, not the involuntary flash of a crisis. "I'm going to want to learn a few more things," he said, "about Ithori culture, about what the longer shape of this, what that looks like. I don't need to know all of it at once, but I want to learn it right." She met his gaze. "I know," she said. "I intend to learn things too. There is a great deal about humans that I don't yet understand." "That's a lot of territory." "I have time," she said, and then, with the dry precision that was entirely her, "survey work involves a great deal of travel time." He laughed, not loudly, because of the ribs, but genuinely. And she watched his face while he did it with the expression he'd learned to understand as the way she looked at things she found worth understanding. Outside, the administrative hub of Velthra Station ran its ordinary days. Cargo cleared, petitions were filed, ships were repaired and dispatched and registered. The large machinery of the hegemony turned over in its efficient, impersonal way, indifferent to the small things that happened inside it. He had thought it was the end. He'd woken in the amber light of a disabled ship and seen her face silver at the corners of her eyes, her hair unbraided for the first time in 5 months, her composure cracked just enough to show him what was behind it. And in the disoriented clarity of a man coming back from the edge, what he'd felt was not relief about surviving. He'd felt something else, something quieter and larger and more like arriving than surviving. She was watching him now the way she'd watched him in the medical bay before she knew he was awake, with the same quality of attention, the same absence of performance, the same silver at the corners of her wide, pale eyes. Not hidden this time, not pressed away with 2 fingertips. Given instead. "The Drelth Cluster survey starts in 6 weeks, she said. "I know. That is not a great deal of time to prepare." She came into the room, which was small enough that the step from the doorway to the desk was 2 paces, and sat in the desk chair with the same ease she'd developed in the medical bay, the ease of someone who had made a decision and was done deliberating about it. "I've already reviewed the preliminary cartographic data. The cluster hasn't been assessed at close range before. There are some interesting anomalies in the long-range scan data." "Anomalies," he said. "Magnetic filament activity," she said, and then she looked at him, and there it was again, the thing he was still learning the name for, moving across her face. Not quite a smile, something with more history in it than a smile. He started to laugh and then thought better of it because of the ribs, and settled for an expression that probably communicated the same thing, and she watched it happen, and her face did the thing that was better than a smile, the private, deliberate, chosen thing. "That," he said, "is the first time you've made a joke." "I have made jokes before," she said, with the precision she brought to everything, including being wrong. "You simply didn't recognize them." "That's possible," he said. "I'm still learning the register." "You are," she agreed. "You've made reasonable progress." He looked at her, the pale violet gray of her skin in the flat neutral light of the temporary quarters, the silver of her eyes, the precise braid, the folded hands on her knees, and thought about 5 months of aft observation windows and 12 minutes of silence and ration packs in amber light, and 11 hours, logged at 20-minute intervals, and a petition form filed at 7:12 in the morning on the second day at Velthris, because she had learned to act before she could find a reason not to. "I want to learn it right," he said. "The longer shape of this. I'm not going to pretend I understand all of what that means yet, but I'm patient. You know that about me." "I do," she said. "I also know that you pay attention." Over time, consistently, without making it a performance. She looked at him steadily. "That is not a common quality, in humans or in Ithari." "Keeps me employed," he said. "It kept you from walking out of the aft observation bay," she said. "The first night, you could have. You had done your walkthrough. There was no practical reason to stay." He had not known she'd thought about that night. He probably should have assumed she would. "I didn't want to leave," he said. The silver at the corners of her eyes steady and chosen. "No," she said quietly, "neither did I." There was a silence then, not the narrow-weighted silence of the ***s emergency days, not the easy, spacious silence of the observation window. Something new, something that didn't have a reference point yet because they hadn't built one. The silence of a first page. He found he wasn't uncomfortable in it. "The preliminary scan data," he said eventually. "What are the anomalies specifically?" She opened her tablet. He watched her navigate to the cartographic file with the brisk efficiency she brought to work, the same precision at the desk as in the medical bay, the same quality of focus. And he thought that this was something he was going to spend a long time learning, the full landscape of how Eris was in the world, and that he had, apparently, somewhere between month 3 and the present moment, become the kind of person who was glad about that. She turned the tablet toward him so he could see the scan overlay. Her fingertip traced a curve in the projected star field. "Here," she said, "and here. The long-range data is inconclusive. We'll need to approach its survey range to assess." "Survey range," he said. "Carefully," she said, with the dry understatement of someone who had spent the last 2 weeks filing incident reports. "Carefully," he agreed. "That's a sound approach." She turned her head to look at him at close range, close enough that the detail of her face was very clear to him, the structure of it, the pale silver of her wide eyes, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the 6 weeks between now and departure and the long survey months beyond them seemed, in that moment, to have a shape he could hold. "We should probably get started," she said. He opened his own tablet and pulled up the crew manifest and the ship specs for whatever Goliath-class carrier the hegemony was going to assign them, and she sat beside him with her tablet and her survey data and the preliminary anomaly maps, and they began the entirely ordinary work of planning what came next. Outside, Velthris Station ran its ordinary days. Cargo cleared and personnel transferred, and the large impersonal machinery of the hegemony turned over in its efficient, unhurried way, indifferent to the small particular things that happened inside it. He had thought it was the end. He'd opened his eyes in the amber light of a disabled ship, disoriented and aching and uncertain of everything except that he was still there, and the first thing he'd seen was her face. The silver quiet at the corners of her eyes, her hair loose, her composure cracked just enough to show him what was behind it. And in the clarity of a man who has been handed back time he thought he'd lost, what he'd felt wasn't triumph or relief or even gratitude, exactly. It was more like recognition, the sharp, specific feeling of understanding, finally, what you'd been looking at. He'd had more time than he expected. He intended to use it carefully.